Howdy, and this will be our last part of this 3-video set on cybersecurity terminology. At any time, if you are confused by this, if you don't know a term in this or in the legal definitions we go through, please send me an email, because I know that sometimes I go through things quickly. I've done this for so long, and I may not be aware that I'm not doing a good job explaining it. So let's move on as soon as our slide moves forward. And let's talk about these terms that you'll hear. And I like simple terms. You know, sometimes I show a slide when I talk about the law, and I'll show what we in technology attribute the term, and then I'll show you the big, long definition and legal terms. But I like simple, and simple is best. So we're going to be using terms such as vulnerability, exploit, threat, and attack. A vulnerability is a weakness in an asset. Now think about this. I leave my door unlocked. That's a weakness in an asset. I leave my car keys where someone can get to them. I leave my password on a sticky. I put something out there that someone could get to. It's a weakness in an asset. And our assets can be physical or virtual. They can be things we touch, doors, locks, guards, whatever. Or they can be electronic. A 0-day is a vulnerability found in the operating system or some piece of software. Now, the exploit is a capability to take advantage of that vulnerability. Just because a vulnerability is there, first of all, no one may know it's there. And then second of all, can that be exploited? Can you figure out a way to exploit it? And if so, the exploit, by taking advantage of the asset, it's the potential to cause serious harm. And I've listed here computer systems, networks, and data systems, and that's really not a good list, because our vulnerabilities can be physical as well, right? So the threat is, if I leave my front door unlocked in Houston and someone can walk into that, then the threat to me is that someone can gain access to my house. It is that possibility, the potential, not the execution. The threat is the potential. It is actually the attack that occurs when the vulnerability is exploited and the threat is fully executed. This is a table I've gotten from somewhere, and there's a lot of words on this, but I just kind of try to put it into effect of what an incident is, what an attack is, what an event is, how your attackers, who they are, look at the objectives, what they want to do, what tools they use to take advantage of the vulnerability, to create the action for the target, to get the unauthorized result. So this is just kind of getting it all out there and saying these are different words we use. But we need to back up. What do we mean by cybersecurity? A lot of times we talk about cybersecurity, and when I ask people to define it, they'll tell me network security or computer security or information security. By the way, if you see terms such as information assurance, long before we had the term cybersecurity, we called it information assurance. But cybersecurity means all those assets around the cyberspace. So when we talk about good cybersecurity, often we're talking about good physical security, because you can't separate the physical from the electronic. And what we want to do in cybersecurity is to protect or defend the use of cyberspace. That's it. We want to protect and defend, right? And that can be anything involved, and the access can be obtained electronically or physically. If somebody comes in with a hammer and breaks my computer and renders it inoperable, that's no different than being locked up with ransomware. I can't get to my data, right? So I've added these definitions here. I want you to just read them on your own time. We're not going to spend a lot of time on them. But if you're not familiar with these terms, you need to start getting comfortable with them. My best definition of computer security is that first one. It does what it's supposed to do and only what it's supposed to do. It doesn't do any more, doesn't do any less, and it only does what it's supposed to do. And as I said before, a lot of times we talk about information security, and I've highlighted a point here. Information is protected from unauthorized access, okay, but we also need to describe the protection of information and the level of protection that has been accomplished. Are we using encryption? What level of encryption are we using? If we're protecting data, how are we protecting the backups? If we are protecting information. How are we protecting the access? How are we setting those access up? Is it based on an individual? Is it based on the role that individual has? And the like. So when we talk about this, keep that in mind. We're not only talking about the unauthorized access, but we're going to want to know what level, how far did you go to protect that data? Because as we'll see in our next series of lectures on the reasonableness standard, a lot of our standards in law is to the reasonable standard. You need to use reasonable practices. Well, that's great and wonderful. Who defines those reasonable practices? A cybersecurity expert? The victim whose data is compromised? So we need to describe the protection, the level. So these are some words you're probably aware of. Social engineering. If you do not know who Kevin Mitnick is, do yourself a big favor and look him up. Google him. He invented the term social engineering. He has some hilarious stories. He was very smart. He was a streetwise kid. He spent years in federal prison, much of it in solitary confinement. When he was put out on parole, he was not allowed access to a phone, to a computer, to anything that connected anywhere, not even a landline, because an attorney made a comment to the judge that this man was so good he could whistle into the phone and bring down our air defense system. All right, so he's a good guy to look at, and I mean good in that I think he's kind of funny, and he's left the dark side now. Phishing, we know what phishing is. We're talking about it. You're going to see this a lot coming up in attacks. You're going to see this in law. Did you properly train your employees? If you did properly train them, did you audit that training? How do you know that training stuck? Scotty's Brewhouse is one of my favorite places to go when I visit Purdue. And a couple of years ago, I read the headline that they lost all their W-2 forms in a phishing attack. And my first thought was, wow, that was an effective phishing attack. Before I read the story and realized the payroll clerk had gotten a bogus email from this someone purporting to be the CEO, wanting copies of the W-2s, and sent the entire database of W-2s. So they had 4,000 name, address, and social security numbers. Malware, you hear that term thrown around. It's software that harms a computer, and there's a variety of types. And it does bad stuff. It steals data, it puts in ransomware, it deletes documents, it adds stuff, you name it, it can do it. Add, subtract, multiply, divide, data, does all this kind of stuff. Encryption is basically converting plain text to ciphertext. It's used to protect data. I'm not going to go into the difference between symmetric and asymmetric except this point. Asymmetric encryption is more complex and better security. So you'll see in court cases where someone used symmetric encryption and should have used asymmetric. Again, anytime you don't know what these terms are, if you don't have a cyber background, just take some time to familiarize yourself with the concept. You don't have to tell me how symmetric and asymmetric algorithms work, if they're 128 or how many bits. You do have to know the concept that symmetric means the same key is used by the sender and receiver. So if the key is stolen, someone can get to it, whereas asymmetric uses different keys. Another concept is I&A, identification and authentication. Identification, think of this. I know your name, I know who you are. But how do I know that that is authentic information? A lot of times I think of this in username and password. I enter my username, I enter my password, and then I get the token sent to my email or text. That's authentication. Hey, if you get this, enter this code and we know who you are. You haven't just gotten the username and password. We're authenticating the identity. This is a two-step process, and IA is very important in cybersecurity. It's one of the NIST control families. Again, you'll see this term coming up in the legal cases. And as I said, identification identifies the user. Authentication typically is something you know, something you have, something you are. Your mother's maiden name, like nobody can figure that one out. A token, as I said, sent, my fingerprint, whatever. Now, non-repudiation is a little bit more complex. I don't want you to worry about the technical details. I want you to understand that it is a technical mechanism for ensuring integrity and origin of data. We couldn't have e-commerce. We couldn't have all the banking functions, all the buying on Amazon and whatever, if we didn't have this. And non-repudiation, in simple terms, is just this. An entity sends a transaction and can later not claim that they did not send that transaction. because of this complexity of using digital signatures and third-party validations and registries and all this. So non-repudiation just means once a transaction is enabled, the party cannot say, no, that didn't come from us, because of these technical mechanisms put in place to authenticate and verify the data origin. Now, auditability or audit is very important. I used to do training, and I always said you don't do training without auditability. Auditability, we do it in financial, we do it in cybersecurity, we do this. It's independent review and examination to assess the adequacy of system controls. System controls, locks on a door, that's a system control. A firewall, that's a system control. Malware scanner, that's a system control. So you want to do audit to ensure compliance. And so then you say, hey, this is the standard you should be, and this is where you are, so I'm going to recommend some changes. You'll see this come up. Read your OPM paper, and you'll see this come up. So I want you to end on this. Just spend some time. Get to know this material. Review the terminology, look for legal definitions, and do what I said. Play around and see where you can find it. And thank you for hanging in. Our next series of videos are going to be on basic terminology and concepts of the law.